the key themes, I would like to read out two passages. And the first is from Osman Ulagay, who is a liberal and actually one of the first journalists in Turkey to write ever on economic issues. So I'd like to take you back into the early 1980s. So the military coup of the 12th September 1980 has just passed. The generals, there has been an election, but generals are still in power. And the country is really moving towards massive structural adjustment, probably the type of structural adjustment Greece might at some point have to face. But back then, in those 80s, the mindset of the time was very much still like a statist economy, import substituting industrialization and so on. So the idea of like Turkey becoming a capitalist country wasn't really not there. Now, so I'm quoting here. The veteran of economic journalism in Turkey, Osman Ulagay, remembers that his colleagues were surprised at the very idea of a dedicated column on economic affairs when he first started writing it in the newspaper Cumhuriyet in the early 1980s. And he says, "It was a time when Ankara reigned supreme and the only regular economic news in the papers referred to the fluctuations in the daily gold rate. The economy was an extension of politics and the state. But the state failed to deliver. Civil servants had to wear their overcoats in the office because the state lacked the funds to pay for heating fuel. Very few economists believed that Özal would be able to transform the economic system, and even fewer really understood the gravity of the changes he was introducing. In economic terms, the decisions of 24 January, when these structural adjustment decisions were first made, meant the dawn of a new age." Now, for those of you who have been to Turkey, this must sound like almost like a bizarre kind of quote, because if you look at Turkey today, it's almost impossible to imagine Turkey as anything but a neoliberal success story in many ways. Private enterprise, entrepreneurialism, personal achievement, wealth generation, all these have become cornerstones of Turkish identity. When you talk about Turkey, today, you talk about investors, businessmen, in every country there are Turkish businessmen. And Turkey today is a thoroughly capitalist country, very commodified culture. People spend their weekends in shopping malls. Only 30 years ago, it was a country without economy section in its newspapers. I find that just amazing. The second quote, which I would like to share with you, is a bit heavier, let's say. And this is from Nebahat Akkoç, who is a feminist from Diyarbakır, the Kurdish region, who has lived through every stage of the Kurdish war in the 1980s. I think her testimony really allows us a deep insight into one of the most brutal periods in the country's recent history, which we tend to forget. It's so easy to forget like the dark sides of the history if you have to move on and if kind of economic progress somehow makes other things more important. Now, so basically Nebahat Akkoç brings us back to, again, the early 1980s and to the prison of Diyarbakır, which became a symbolic place for the violence of the state against Kurds, and also became a symbol of Kurdish resistance against the state. And she says, "One day everything changed. When I arrived at the prison, I was told that a new prison administration had taken over. There were dogs everywhere. We were ordered to queue up one by one and made to wait for hours. Villagers who did not understand Turkish and stepped out of the queue were beaten up. The prison chief, Yildiran, would roam around the queues, always accompanied by his dog and dressed in a black overcoat. Announcements blaring through the loudspeakers were repeated every minute. The time for visits will be limited to 2 minutes. It is forbidden to speak any other language than Turkish." Now, this kind of apocalyptic scenario inspired, among other things, Harold Pinter's Mountain Language, the play, about people who are not allowed to speak their own tongue. But I think this this quotation really gives a good sense of how brutal and how traumatic these years were, and not only in the Kurdish areas. But basically, I think that this passage helps us to explore or understand how an officer who was sent from Ankara, basically to bring the prison up to the times, could break and destroy hundreds, and if not thousands, of mostly innocent men and women. And it's basically, this is also the starting point of the massive kind of Kurdish uprising against the Turkish state. In many ways, these people, young people, were tortured into becoming extremely, tortured into joining the PKK. Now, both quotes are from around the same period. You will have realized they refer to the early 1980s, and they're located roughly in this time of transformation of power from military dictatorship to civilian government. In 1983, Turgut Özal was chosen as the only option not endorsed by the generals. And I think you see a clear pattern here also already emerging, which is the tension between economic liberalization and ethnic war, or between the emergence of an entrepreneurial spirit and a new middle class on the one side, and the persistence of an authoritarian state on the other. And at first sight, this might strike you as paradoxical, but it's these cycles of tension, really, which run through much of Turkey's recent past, and which you will also find in the narrative of the book. And I guess by now it's also pretty obvious that this book, even though it's called Turkey since 1989, is not starting with in the year 1989, really, but in 1980. Even though, of course, 1989 was very important for Turkey, there's no question about it. If you think about it, before 1989, I mean, during the Cold War, Turkey basically was a country without the hinterland. Bulgaria, the entire Black Sea, the Caucasus, Syria were all under Soviet domination. Iran and Iraq were caught in a war of mutual destruction. The only remaining neighbor, which was also an ally, was Greece, and with Greece relations were, let's say, frosty at best, and much worse at other times. In this respect, 1989 actually did create the conditions for Turkey's return to its historical neighborhood in terms of economy, culture, politics, and it opened up the way for Ahmet Davutoğlu, of course, but before him Özal and Ismail Cem, who advocated Turkey's return to its neighborhood. But despite the importance of 1989, the trajectory of Turkey's recent past was really set with the military coup of 1980. It was a Turkish Islamic synthesis which was endorsed by the generals, which really shaped the decades to come. Basically a mixture of Turkish nationalism, religious conservatism, and neoliberal adjustment policies. And that really is still very much the kind of ideological, political framework within which Turkey has been operating ever since. So, now let me come to my fourth question and final question. And that is, so what is the image emerging from the empirical kind of material which I'm discussing in the book? In a nutshell, I argue that modern Turkey has been shaped by a number of struggles over power. At the very heart of all these contestations is the state, which of course preceded the Turkish Republic by roughly 500 years, probably by more than that. And I'll very briefly go back to the early days of the Republic. The Turkish Republic was established by the nationalist cadres of the Committee of Union and Progress. It was a one-party dictatorship under the leadership of the Republican People's Party and based on a modernist authoritarian ideology. The Republic changed the visible layers of the society of Turkey, particularly in the western provinces, by introducing European dress, legal codes and social norms. It created a small layer of a middle-class elite which inherited the values of this project, while it excluded large segments of society from wealth and power. This Republican experiment was shaped by rupture and change, obviously. I mean, especially in the established historiographies it's all about the big revolution and the completely new beginning. But when you actually look at it, and that's what Jan Zürcher argues, it also showed great deals of continuity. Obviously, it was the cadres of the late Ottoman state and the Committee of Union and Progress which established the new republic. So there was also a lot of continuity. For instance, and there I come to the issue of secularism, actually the Turkish Republic never went for a secular or for laic arrangement. It, in fact, really continued the Ottoman tradition of administering Islam by the state. This is important because this is one of the core myths of Turkish historiography, that Turkey is in fact secular. But you know, Turkey has had a central religious authority, the Diyanet İşleri Reisliği, which later became the Başkanlığı, which now has 80,000 members, and which basically has been providing Islam to everybody in a secular state, wanted it or not wanted it. So the idea that there has been some sort of disestablishment between state and religion is a complete myth, but it's amazing how powerful these histories are, because even in the European Union, people somehow sometimes buy into this idea that Turkey is secular. It's not, and even less so these days. Now, with the introduction of multi-party politics in 1946, and then also with the election of the Democrat Party in 1950, the one-party dictatorship, which was established in 1923, officially came to an end. But this is important here. The autocratic core of this one-party dictatorship was never fully dissolved. It morphed into a parallel structure within the bureaucracy, the military and the judiciary, and also in parts of the Republican People's Party. And this is the guardian state, which I've already mentioned. And ever since the 1950s, the result has been a relatively unique coexistence, I believe, between two actors, the non-elected guardians and the elected representatives. Mostly, the elected representatives were of the center-right, i.e. they were economically liberal and socially conservative. And between these two actors, of course, you have the bulk of civil society organizations, which have grown in time, especially after the 1980s. But obviously, civil society is a very powerless kind of institution when you have to fight a state on the one side and political parties on the other. As you will all know, there was a number of military interventions in 1960, 71, 1980, 1997. Nevertheless, there were also regular elections, and there were democratic governments. Key policy areas, however, citizenship, regional development, you know, whether you invest in the Kurdish regions, in the east, foreign policy, all this really remained under the tutelage of the guardians. And dissenting movements, whether of socialist, nationalist, or Islamist persuasion, were eventually reined in, oppressed, or even crushed. And if you have a time to maybe look at the copy, there is what I did I did this overview of political parties in Turkey. And when you look at it, actually, and then I also established a column on, you know, first there was a column on when these parties were established, and then I had to add another column on when they were closed down. Because of every political party in Turkey, with the exception of the Kemalist, the Republican People's Party, has been closed down, had to reopen a few years later under a different name. I mean, that shows some, and they were closed down either by military coups or by the Constitutional Court, which was established after a military coup in 1960. So the idea of how the guardian state made sure that certain things simply did not happen. It basically maintained a big glass ceiling over the political space of Turkey. And I think this is really special. Because it's different from both the authoritarian regimes of the Middle East, where you had, until recently at least, authoritarianism in your face. I mean, you knew we have a dictator, we don't have rule of law, so you know, we can act accordingly. But it's also obviously different from the more mature democracies of Southern Europe, Greece included in that, where you have a more established rule of law and a relatively accountable and transparent political process. And I think it is the continued coexistence and the tension of elected governments, unelected guardians who've been pulling the strings, which is problematic here. And